An elderly man, Marcus Reed, is stopped and arrested by a young, overzealous police officer. What the officer doesn't realize is that Marcus isn't just any man. He's the governor of the state, walking incognito to experience life as an ordinary citizen. This wrongful arrest sparks outrage, ignites protests, and forces both the officer and society to confront deep-rooted prejudice and injustice. How will Marcus use this moment to drive change? Will the officer face the consequences of his actions and seek redemption? Stay tuned for this powerful story of justice, transformation, and societal reckoning. Don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe for more stories like this, and hit the notification bell so you never miss an update. What would you do in Marcus's position? Let us know in the comments. The large bay windows of the governor's office overlooked the bustling streets below, but Marcus Reed felt a growing distance between him and the world outside. The office, once a place of inspiration, now felt like a gilded cage, shielding him from the reality he sought to engage with. Stacks of policy documents, charts, and figures sat neatly on his desk, each demanding his attention, but none of them connected him to the heartbeat of the people he had sworn to serve. At 65 years old, Marcus had seen and lived through tumultuous times. He was not a politician by birth, but by purpose. Raised in a tight-knit black community that had fought long and hard for equality, Marcus had grown up believing in the power of service. His father had been a preacher, his mother an activist, both teaching him the value of dignity, resilience, and leadership. These were values he carried into his career as a lawyer, and later, into the governor's mansion. But now, nearly a decade into his governorship, he felt disconnected. Despite the progress his administration had made on paper, the distance between himself and his constituents was growing. He no longer understood their daily struggles, their fears, their frustrations. Every day, the news reported another incident of police violence, another protest over injustice, and Marcus couldn't help but feel like he was watching from the sidelines, removed from the real battle. Marcus stood up from his desk, moving toward the window. He gazed out at the skyline, his hands clasped behind his back. The city, with its towering buildings and rapid pace, had a way of making its inhabitants feel small and inconsequential. But somewhere out there were people, ordinary people, going about their daily lives, navigating challenges Marcus no longer understood firsthand, and he couldn't shake the feeling that he was failing them. His chief of staff, Alicia Grant, knocked gently on the door and entered. She carried a file, her usual no-nonsense expression softened with a hint of concern. Alicia had worked with Marcus for nearly 10 years, and at that time she had come to know when something was weighing on him. "Governor," she began, "I have the final report on the new housing initiative." Marcus turned from the window, offering a polite smile. "Thank you, Alicia." She handed him the file but lingered, sensing the weight of his mood. "You seem distracted," she observed carefully. "Is everything all right?" Marcus exhaled, rubbing the back of his neck. "I don't know, Alicia. I'm just feeling disconnected. I read these reports, attend these meetings, but I feel like I'm not really seeing what's happening out there, not really understanding what the people are going through." Alicia, always pragmatic, gave a thoughtful nod. "You've spent years fighting for the people. It's easy to lose touch when you're surrounded by bureaucracy, but your leadership still means everything to them." Marcus appreciated her words, but they didn't ease the gnawing feeling in his gut. He needed to do more than sit behind a desk and make decisions based on reports. He needed to see things for himself, to reconnect with the people he served. That afternoon, Marcus made a decision. After finishing his meetings for the day, he called in his closest security detail and outlined a plan. He would go undercover, incognito, for a day. No entourage, No security detail, no press. He would walk through the streets, observe how ordinary citizens lived, and understand their reality without the interference of his title. His team was hesitant, of course, but Marcus insisted. He had done something similar years ago, and it had been eye-opening. Now, more than ever, he needed to feel the pulse of people. The next morning, Marcus dressed simply. A dark coat, jeans, and a cap pulled low over his face. He looked nothing like the governor today, just another man going for a walk. As he stepped out of the unmarked car in a small, quiet town on the city's edge, he took a deep breath. This was where he needed to be. Away from the politics and the bureaucracy, here he could remember why he'd gotten into public service in the first place. The neighborhood wasn't unfamiliar to him, but it had changed since the last time he'd walked these streets. The storefronts were closed or boarded up, the streets littered with debris. There was an air of quiet desperation here, a place long forgotten by the city's power brokers. This was where Marcus wanted to spend his morning, walking among the people who lived in the margins, listening to their struggles. But as he set off down the street, he had no idea how drastically this quiet walk would change his life. Scott Williams sat in his patrol car, tapping his fingers on the steering wheel, his eyes scanning the neighborhood. It was a slow morning, like most mornings in this part of town. The east side was a run-down area, plagued by poverty and crime, at least according to Scott's view. He didn't mind the quiet, though. Slow mornings meant fewer chances for trouble. But even on a quiet day, Scott never let his guard down. At 28, Scott was a young but ambitious officer. He prided himself on being tough, no-nonsense, and reliable. His father, David Williams, had been a police officer too, spending 30 years on the force before retiring. Scott had grown up listening to his father's stories about the job, how being a cop was about respect, control, and maintaining order. His father believed that some people just didn't understand how the world worked, and it was the job of the police to remind them. Scott had followed in his father's footsteps, and in many ways, he was still walking in his shadow. His father's old-school approach to policing had deeply influenced him, shaping his view of the world. It was simple in Scott's mind. There were good guys and bad guys. The good guys wore uniforms, followed the rules, and enforced the law. The bad guys broke those rules, caused trouble, and made life harder for everyone else. And if you wanted to keep the streets safe, you had to be tough. He glanced over at his partner, Jackson, who was half asleep in the passenger seat. Jackson had been on the force for 10 years, but his enthusiasm had faded. For him, this was just a job, a paycheck. Scott didn't understand that mentality. He took his role as a police officer seriously, maybe too seriously, some of his colleagues joked. But Scott saw his job as a duty, a responsibility to keep the city safe. As he drove down the narrow streets of the east side, Scott noticed the decay. Abandoned buildings, graffiti, broken sidewalks. It was a far cry from the neighborhoods where he had grown up. And while he didn't have much sympathy for the people who lived here, he saw himself as their protector. They didn't understand what he was doing for them, but he was keeping order even if they didn't appreciate it. Scott spotted an elderly black man walking slowly down the sidewalk, hands in his pockets, wearing a dark coat and a cap pulled low over his face. The man didn't fit. Something about him set off alarms in Scott's mind. It wasn't unusual for him to be suspicious. After all, his instincts had kept him out of trouble more than once. Scott narrowed his eyes, watching the man closely. What was he doing here? He didn't look like he belonged in this neighborhood. Scott's training kicked in, and without thinking, he pulled the car over to the curb. Jackson looked up from his half-asleep state. "What's up?" Scott didn't take his eyes off the man. "Suspicious guy. I'm going to check him out." Jackson shrugged, indifferent. "Go ahead. I'll be here. Scott stepped out of the car, his hand resting casually on his belt, and began walking toward the man. As he approached, his suspicions grew. The man seemed too calm, too out of place. Scott's instincts told him this was someone who didn't belong here, someone who could be trouble. "Hey," Scott called out, his voice firm. "Let me see some ID." The man stopped and turned slowly, his expression calm but wary. "Good morning, officer," the man said, his voice steady. "Is there something wrong?" Scott didn't answer the question. His focus was on control. "ID, please," he repeated. The man hesitated, and Scott's suspicion deepened. Why wasn't he complying? Most people in this neighborhood would produce their ID immediately, eager to avoid trouble. But this man didn't seem afraid. "I'm just taking a walk," the man said, his voice polite but firm. "Is there a reason you need to see my ID?" Scott's frustration began to rise. This wasn't the way things were supposed to go. "You're in a neighborhood known for criminal activity and you're not cooperating," Scott said, his tone hardening. "I need to see your ID." The man didn't move. "Officer," he said slowly, "I don't think I've done anything wrong. I'm just here for a walk." Scott's patience snapped. In his mind, this was exactly the kind of attitude that led to trouble. People thinking they could question authority, thinking they didn't have to follow the rules. Scott had seen it 100 times before, and it always led to the same outcome. Without waiting for an explanation, Scott stepped forward and grabbed the man's arm. "You're under arrest," Scott said curtly, pulling out his handcuffs. The man's eyes widened, but he didn't resist. "What are you doing?" he asked, his voice still calm, though there was a flicker of disbelief. "I haven't done anything wrong." Scott ignored him, snapping the cuffs onto his wrists. "You're under arrest for refusing to comply with an officer's instructions." The man looked up at him, his eyes locking onto Scott's with a gaze that was unsettlingly calm. "You have no idea who you're arresting," the man said quietly, his voice almost a whisper. Scott didn't respond. He didn't care who this man was. He had a job to do, and in his mind, this was just another suspect who thought he was above the law. The walk back to the patrol car was tense. Scott kept his grip firm on the man's arm, though the man made no effort to resist. In fact, his composure seemed to unnerve Scott. Most people he arrested were either angry, frightened, or defiant, but this man was none of those things. He walked calmly, even with the handcuffs on, as if he knew something Scott didn't. By now, a small group of people had gathered on the sidewalk, watching the scene unfold. Some had their phones out recording the arrest. Scott could hear the murmurs of the crowd, but he didn't pay them any mind. This was just another arrest, another routine part of his job. As he pushed the man into the back of the squad car, Scott glanced back at the crowd. One of the onlookers, a young woman, was shaking her head, her phone pointed at them. "Unbelievable," she muttered. "Another one." Scott felt a flare of irritation, but quickly pushed it down. He was doing his job. That was all that mattered. Once the man was secured in the back seat, Scott slid into the driver's seat and glanced at his partner. Jackson looked mildly interested, but not concerned. "What's the story with this guy?" Scott shrugged. "Suspicious behavior. Didn't comply when I asked for ID." Jackson raised an eyebrow. "You check his ID now?" "No need," Scott said, shaking his head. "He's probably got something to hide." Jackson shrugged again and went back to his paperwork, but Scott couldn't shake the feeling that something was off about this whole situation. The man's calmness, his quiet statement, "You have no idea who you're arresting." It all lingered in the back of Scott's mind, like an itch he couldn't scratch. As they drove toward the station, Scott glanced at the rearview mirror. The man sat quietly, his hands resting in his lap, his gaze steady but distant. He didn't look like someone who had just been arrested. He didn't look afraid or angry or anything Scott had come to expect from situations like this. The ride was silent, save for the hum of the engine. Scott found himself wishing the man would say something, do something, anything that would break the unsettling calm that had settled over the car. But the man remained quiet, staring out the window as if he were on a casual drive, not sitting in the back of a police car in handcuffs. When they arrived at the station, Scott led the man inside, where he was processed with the same indifference given to any other detainee. Scott didn't bother to look at the man's identification, certain that he had just arrested another suspect trying to hide something. But he couldn't have been more wrong. It didn't take long for the scene on the quiet street to become a viral sensation. As Scott processed Marcus back at the station, videos of the arrest began to flood social media. The footage, captured by several bystanders, was shocking in its simplicity. An elderly black man being cuffed and led away by a white police officer, no apparent threat or struggle, just a stark image of power and injustice. On platforms like Twitter and Instagram, the video spread like wildfire. The hashtags started to roll in, #another arrest, #justice for elderly man, #profiling again. The video resonated with people who had long been critical of police practices, particularly those involving racial profiling. But what no one knew yet, what made this particular arrest so explosive, was the true identity of the man in handcuffs. Elena Diaz, a young journalist for the Darlington Daily, scrolled through her social media feed that afternoon, noticing the video almost immediately. The clip wasn't unique. Unfortunately, she had seen plenty of similar footage over the years. But something about the way the man carried himself, the calmness he exuded even while being arrested, caught her attention. Her instincts told her there was more to this story. She reached for her phone, dialing her editor. "Jeff, there's something happening downtown. An arrest that's gaining traction online. I think it's worth looking into. I'm heading to the station." Her editor grunted on the other end, skeptical. "Another police incident? These happen all the time, Elena. What makes this one different?" "I don't know yet, but I've got a feeling this isn't just another routine arrest." Elena was already gathering her things, preparing to head out the door. She could feel the buzz of a story building, the kind that could shift the narrative of local news and expose something bigger. Back at the station, Marcus sat silently in a holding cell, his wrists still sore from the handcuffs. The officers who had processed him did so with the usual disinterest they showed to most detainees. It wasn't unusual for men like Marcus, black men, older men, men from certain neighborhoods, to end up in these cells. To them, he was just another nameless suspect, another piece of paperwork to be filed and forgotten. Scott, meanwhile, stood at his desk typing up his arrest report. He hadn't thought to check Marcus's identification, and as far as he was concerned, it didn't matter. The man hadn't cooperated, and that was all Scott needed to justify the arrest. He was still riding the high of authority, his mind spinning with the self-assurance that he had done the right thing. But as the minutes ticked by, something began to nag at him. The man's words from earlier echoed in his mind. "You have no idea who you're arresting." Scott tried to shrug it off, but the thought clung to him, making him uncomfortable. Then, just as Scott was about to file his report, another officer approached him. "Hey, Williams," the officer said, leaning on Scott's desk. "You checked this guy's ID yet?" Scott frowned. "No, why?" The officer handed Scott a file. "You might want to. We just ran his prints. You're not going to believe this." Scott's stomach twisted with a sudden sense of dread. He opened the file. His eyes scanned the information quickly, disbelief settling over him. The name on the file, Marcus Reed, leapt out at him, bringing with it a realization that turned his blood cold. He had just arrested the governor of the state. Scott felt the room around him spin. His hands, once steady and confident, trembled as he held the file. How could this be possible? How could he have made such a monumental mistake? He thought back to the man's calmness, the way he had carried himself, and it all made sense now. He wasn't just an ordinary man walking through the neighborhood. He was the governor, a man who held more power than Scott could ever dream of. Panic set in. Scott quickly stood, abandoning the half-finished report on his desk, and made his way to the holding cells. He had to fix this somehow, but as he approached the cell where Marcus was being held, he realized that fixing this would not be easy. Marcus sat on the bench, his hands resting on his knees, still composed despite everything that had happened. When he saw Scott approach, he looked up, his eyes meeting the officer's with that same calm, piercing gaze. "Well," Marcus said quietly, "I believe we should have a conversation now, Officer Williams." Scott's throat tightened. He wanted to speak, to explain, to apologize, but no words came out. The weight of his mistake, his pride, and his deeply ingrained biases all collided in his mind, leaving him speechless. This wasn't just an arrest gone wrong. This was about to become a disaster. Chief Jonathan Miller was having a relatively quiet day until his phone rang with an urgent call from one of his lieutenants. The moment he heard the news, his entire demeanor changed. "The governor?" Miller repeated, disbelief in his voice. "We've arrested the governor?" The voice on the other end was tense. "Yes, sir. Officer Williams brought him in this morning. He didn't check his ID until after the arrest was processed." Miller felt a wave of frustration and panic wash over him. Of all the things to happen under his watch, this was beyond anything he could have imagined. Arresting a governor, especially under questionable circumstances, wasn't just a problem. It was a full-blown crisis. "I'll be right there," Miller barked, slamming the phone down. As he made his way to the holding cells, his mind raced with the implications. The arrest of a sitting governor could ruin careers, destroy reputations, and worse, ignite a public outcry that would damage the entire department. There was no way to contain this. The media would get wind of it, if they hadn't already, and once that happened, there would be no controlling the narrative. When Miller arrived at the cell, Scott was standing outside, pale and shaken. The chief barely glanced at him before turning his attention to Marcus, who sat calmly, observing the unfolding chaos with quiet dignity. "Governor Reed," Miller said, his voice tight with forced professionalism, "I can't begin to express how sorry I am for what's happened here. We didn't—" Marcus held up a hand, silencing the chief. "I understand, Chief Miller. Mistakes happen. But this mistake, this is bigger than just me." Miller swallowed hard. He knew exactly what Marcus meant. This wasn't just about a misunderstanding. This was about the broader issue of racial profiling, about systemic bias, about everything that had been boiling beneath the surface for years. Marcus stood slowly and deliberately. "I would like to be released now, Chief," he said, his voice steady but firm. "And I'd like to have a word with your officer before I go." Miller glanced at Scott, who looked like he wanted to disappear. The chief nodded, motioning for the officers nearby to open the cell. As Marcus stepped out, he turned to Scott, his expression unreadable. "You've made a mistake, Officer Williams," Marcus said, his tone calm but authoritative. "A mistake that many others like me have experienced, though they don't often get the chance to speak about it. But I want you to understand something. This isn't just about you. This is about a system that allows people like you to make decisions based on assumptions rather than facts." Scott's heart pounded in his chest, and all the excuses he had rehearsed in his head vanished. He stood there silent, feeling the weight of Marcus's words pressing down on him. "Remember this," Marcus said, his voice low but powerful. "This moment will follow you. What you choose to do with it is up to you." And with that, Marcus turned and walked away. leaving Scott standing there, his mind swirling with a mixture of guilt, confusion, and fear. By the time Marcus Reed stepped out of the police station, the news had already spread like wildfire. Outside, a crowd had begun to gather, small at first but growing rapidly with every passing minute. The video of his arrest had made its way to the media, and the revelation that the man in the video was the governor himself only added fuel to the fire. People were outraged. Lisa Green, a well-known civil rights activist, stood at the forefront of the crowd, a megaphone in hand. She had been fighting for police reform for years, and this incident was the tipping point she had been waiting for. "This is about more than just Governor Reed," Lisa shouted into the megaphone, her voice cutting through the noise of the crowd. "This is about every single person who has been racially profiled, every person who has been arrested without cause, every person who has been treated as less than human by a system that's supposed to protect us." The crowd responded with cheers and chants, their anger palpable. Signs were raised, fists were clenched, and the energy in the air was electric. What had started as a small protest was quickly becoming a full-blown movement. Reporters from local news outlets had already arrived, their cameras trained on the growing protest and the governor's release from the station. Elena Diaz was among them, her notebook in hand, scribbling down details as she watched the scene unfold. She knew this story was about to explode, not just locally, but nationally. The image of an elderly black governor being arrested for simply walking through a neighborhood was too powerful to ignore. As Marcus stepped out into the street, the crowd erupted in applause and cheers. But Marcus, ever composed, didn't raise his hands in victory. Instead, he looked out at the people, his people, with a somber expression. This wasn't a moment of celebration. This was a moment of reckoning. Inside the station, Scott Williams sat at his desk, staring blankly at the paperwork in front of him. He could hear the noise of the protest outside, the chants, the shouts, the rising anger, but it felt distant, as if it were happening in another world. His mind was elsewhere, lost in the labyrinth of his own thoughts. How had he ended up here? Scott had always believed in the righteousness of his actions. He had been taught to see the world in black and white, good and bad, and up until now, that worldview had served him well. He had followed the rules, done his job, and believed that he was making a difference, keeping the streets safe. But now, that certainty was crumbling. The words Marcus had spoken to him echoed in his mind, gnawing at him, forcing him to confront a truth he had spent years ignoring. "You've made a mistake, Officer Williams." Those words carried more weight than Scott had anticipated. They weren't just about this one arrest. They were about everything. Every assumption he had made, every bias he had acted on, every time he had judged someone by the color of their skin or the way they looked. He thought about his father, about the lessons he had been taught growing up. "Be tough," his father had always said. "Don't let them see weakness. You're in charge out there." But what if being in charge didn't mean being right? What if his father had been wrong? The thought terrified Scott. It shook the very foundation of his identity. He had always prided himself on being a strong officer, a protector. But now, for the first time, he was beginning to wonder if he had been protecting the wrong thing. Outside, the protests were growing louder, and Scott knew that the consequences of his actions were far from over. The world outside the station was changing, and Scott could feel it shifting beneath his feet. The tension in the air was palpable as Marcus Reed stepped outside the police station. The crowd, which had grown significantly since his arrest became public, fell silent for a brief moment. Hundreds of eyes turned to him, waiting to see how he would respond to the injustice he had just experienced. Cameras clicked, and reporters strained to get closer, while protesters held signs high, their anger simmering just beneath the surface. Lisa Green, standing at the front of the crowd, nodded respectfully toward Marcus. She had been leading protests for years, but she knew that this moment was different. This moment wasn't just about one man's arrest, it was about decades of systemic abuse, racial profiling, and deep-seated prejudice. The people weren't just angry for Marcus. They were angry for all the forgotten names and faces that had come before him. Marcus, however, wasn't swept up in the fervor of the crowd. His expression was calm, but there was a weight to his presence that commanded attention. He wasn't interested in personal revenge or vengeance. This was an opportunity to speak not just for himself, but for everyone who had been victimized by the system. He approached the impromptu stage that had been set up outside City Hall, his steps deliberate, his face betraying no emotion. His security detail, who had been reinstated the moment the mistake was realized, moved cautiously beside him, trying to anticipate what might happen next. The crowd roared with anticipation, the sounds of frustration, anger, and hope blending into one powerful voice. Marcus stood at the microphone, gazing at the mass of people before him. He saw their anger and their hurt, but he also saw their desire for change. This was more than a protest, it was a movement. Marcus raised his hand and slowly, the noise of the crowd began to die. When silence finally fell, he began to speak, his voice steady but filled with emotion. "This morning I was arrested," Marcus began, his tone clear but devoid of any bitterness. "Not because I had committed any crime, not because I posed a threat to anyone's safety. I was arrested because of what I looked like, because I didn't fit into the assumptions someone had made about me." The crowd listened intently, hanging on to every word. Marcus continued, "But I'm not here to talk about my arrest alone. I am here because what happened to me is something that happens to people every day. People who don't have the privilege of walking free because of their status or title. People who are judged before they're even spoken to, who are arrested before they're asked for their name." A murmur of agreement rippled through the crowd. "I want you to understand something," Marcus said, his voice growing stronger. "This is not about one officer's mistake. This is not about a single arrest. This is about a system that has allowed these kinds of mistakes to become routine. A system that makes assumptions about people based on the color of their skin, the way they dress, or the neighborhood they live in." Marcus paused, letting his words sink in. "I stand before you today not as a governor seeking revenge or personal vindication, but as a man who believes in justice," he said. "Real justice, not just for me, but for every single person who has been wronged by this broken system." The crowd erupted in applause, their chants of justice ringing through the air. "But justice is not just a word," Marcus continued. "It's not a slogan we shout at rallies. Justice means real change, and that change starts here, with all of us." As Marcus spoke, his voice became more impassioned. He called for reforms, deep, systemic reforms that would address the biases that had been built into the very fabric of the police force and other institutions. He spoke of accountability, transparency, and the need for law enforcement to reflect the communities they served. But more than that, he spoke about healing the wounds of injustice, healing the divisions that had long kept people apart. "We must move forward," Marcus said, his voice carrying over the crowd. "We must demand better, not just from those in power, but from ourselves. This is not about blaming individuals. It's about fixing a system that has failed all of us." By the time Marcus finished his speech, the crowd was cheering not just for him, but for the future they hoped to build together. He had taken the moment of his own arrest and transformed it into something much larger, something that resonated far beyond the city limits of Darlington. Marcus had given the people a voice, and they were ready to use it. Inside the station, Officer Scott Williams could hear the muffled sounds of the protesters outside, voices chanting, demanding justice. The same voices that just hours earlier would have felt distant to him now felt like they were closing in, tightening around him. He sat at his desk, hands clenched into fists, staring at the paperwork in front of him without really seeing it. The press conference was being broadcast on the station's TV, but Scott couldn't bear to watch it. He already knew what Marcus Reed was saying, and he knew that every word was true. The governor's arrest had been a mistake, not just a mistake of procedure, but a mistake born out of Scott's own biases. The realization was like a weight pressing down on his chest, making it hard to breathe. Scott had spent his entire career believing that he was on the right side of the law. He had prided himself on being tough, on not backing down, on maintaining control. But now, in the cold light of day, he was beginning to see that his toughness hadn't come from a place of strength. It had come from fear. Fear of losing control. Fear of the unknown. Fear of people he didn't understand. He thought about his father, David Williams, who had drilled into him the importance of being strong, of not showing weakness. Scott had spent years trying to live up to his father's expectations, and for the most part, he had succeeded. But now, all of that felt hollow. What good was strength if it was built on the backs of people like Marcus Reed? What good was control if it came at the cost of justice? Scott felt the guilt rise inside him, a tidal wave of shame and regret. He had thought he was doing his job, keeping the streets safe, maintaining order. But now, for the first time, he saw that his version of safety and order was one-sided. It protected some people at the expense of others. It maintained control for those in power while marginalizing the vulnerable. For the first time in his life, Scott doubted himself. He doubted everything he had been taught, everything he had believed. He thought about the look in Marcus's eyes when he had been arrested, the calmness, the dignity. Marcus had known all along that Scott had made a mistake. And yet, even now, after everything, Marcus had spoken about change, not vengeance. He had called for reform, not punishment. Scott's phone buzzed on his desk, pulling him out of his thoughts. It was a text message from his father. Heard about the arrest. Don't apologize, stay strong. Scott stared at the message for a long time, feeling a knot form in his stomach. He had always followed his father's advice, had always looked to him for guidance. But now, Scott wasn't sure if his father was right anymore. Strength wasn't what was needed here. What was needed was something harder to come by: humility. The humility to admit that he had been wrong. The humility to seek forgiveness. Scott stood up from his desk, his heart pounding. He couldn't ignore this any longer. He couldn't hide behind his badge or his authority. He had to face what he had done. The days following Marcus Reed's speech were tense. The protests continued to grow, with people from all over the state converging on Darlington to demand justice and reform. News outlets covered the story around the clock, and it seemed that everyone had something to say about the arrest that had sparked it all. Scott, meanwhile, had been avoiding the public eye. He had requested time off from the department, unsure of how to face the growing scrutiny. His colleagues, once supportive, had grown distant, unsure of how to react to the firestorm that had erupted around him. But Scott knew he couldn't stay in the shadows forever. He had made a mistake, and he needed to take responsibility for it. A press conference was scheduled for later in the week, and Scott had been given the opportunity to speak. He had spent hours agonizing over what to say, rehearsing his apology over and over in his head, but now, standing in front of the podium, with the bright lights of the cameras trained on him, all of his carefully prepared words seemed to slip away. Scott took a deep breath, his hands shaking as he gripped the sides of the podium. "I'm here today because I made a mistake," Scott began, his voice shaky but steady. "A mistake that has caused a lot of pain, not just to Governor Reed, but to the people of this community." The room was silent, the cameras whirring softly as they captured every word. When I arrested Governor Reed, I didn't know who he was, Scott continued, but that's not the point. The point is that I didn't take the time to ask. I made an assumption about him, based on nothing more than the color of his skin and the neighborhood he was walking through. Scott paused, his throat tightening. I've spent a lot of time thinking about what I did, and I've come to realize that it wasn't just one mistake. It was part of a larger problem, a problem that I've been part of for years without even realizing it. I've been part of a system that treats people differently based on their appearance, their background, or where they come from. And for that, I'm sorry. There was a murmur of surprise in the room. Apologies from police officers were rare, and this one felt particularly raw, unpolished. Scott swallowed hard, forcing himself to continue. I'm not asking for forgiveness. I know that my words can't undo the harm I've caused, but I want you to know that I'm committed to changing. I'm committed to listening, to learning, and to doing better. He stepped back from the podium, his heart pounding in his chest. The room remained silent for a few seconds, and then the reporters began shouting questions, but Scott couldn't hear them over the sound of his own thoughts. He had said what he needed to say, and now all he could do was wait. In the days following Scott's apology, the momentum for change continued to build. Marcus Reed, now firmly positioned as a leader of the growing movement for reform, worked closely with lawmakers, civil rights leaders, and community organizers to draft new legislation aimed at addressing systemic issues that had led to his arrest. The reforms were sweeping, covering everything from police training and accountability to community oversight and racial sensitivity programs. The goal was not just to prevent another incident like Marcus's arrest, but to create a system that was fairer, more just, and more responsive to the needs of all citizens. Mayor Emily Caldwell, who had initially been reluctant to get involved, threw her support behind the reforms, recognizing that the public demand for change was too strong to ignore. These reforms aren't just about fixing one problem, Marcus said during a press conference. They're about fixing a system that has been broken for far too long. The new policies were passed with overwhelming support from the public, and though there was resistance from some within the police force, the majority of officers recognized the need for change. Scott watched the reforms take shape from a distance, no longer part of the police department. He had resigned shortly after his apology, knowing that he couldn't continue in the job that had once defined him. But he wasn't done working. He had started volunteering with local community groups, using his experiences to help bridge the gap between law enforcement and the communities they served. It wasn't enough to erase the past, but it was a start. Months had passed since Marcus Reed's wrongful arrest had ignited a movement for change. The initial surge of protests had transformed into organized efforts for reform, and the city of Darlington had become a symbol of what was possible when people came together to demand accountability and justice. The new laws were now in effect, bringing hope that future generations would not face the same injustices. Marcus Reed, though exhausted by the whirlwind of events, felt an immense sense of purpose. His arrest, while humiliating, had become a catalyst for something much bigger than himself. The governor's office had been flooded with letters of support, and messages of gratitude came from across the nation. But more than the public accolades, Marcus found solace in the knowledge that he had helped initiate a real and lasting transformation. He sat in his office one evening, the quiet hum of the city barely audible through the closed windows. Alicia Grant, his ever-reliable chief of staff, entered with a file in her hand. "Governor," she began, "the latest polling numbers are in. Your approval rating has skyrocketed since the reforms were passed." Marcus chuckled lightly. "That's good to hear, but I'm more interested in how these reforms are being implemented. Polls come and go, but the real work is just beginning." Alicia nodded, placing the file on his desk. "You're right, of course. The community oversight boards are being formed, and the new racial sensitivity training for the police force starts next month. People are paying attention, Governor. This isn't just talk anymore." Marcus leaned back in his chair, his thoughts drifting. He couldn't help but think back to that fateful morning, walking the streets in anonymity, only to be thrown into the spotlight in the worst way possible. But the journey since then had been transformative, not just for the city, but for him personally. "Alicia," Marcus said, his voice thoughtful, "I want to make sure these reforms last. Not just while I'm in office, but long after I'm gone. We've started something important here, and we can't let it fade away." Alicia smiled. "We won't. You've sparked something that won't easily die out." Marcus nodded, feeling the weight of that responsibility. This wasn't just about one man or one office. It was about creating a system that worked for everyone. And though the work ahead was daunting, Marcus knew it was worth every bit of effort. Scott Williams had spent the last few months trying to rebuild his life. After his public apology, he had resigned from the police department, knowing that his role as an officer was no longer tenable. The guilt that had weighed him down since the day of Marcus's arrest had become a motivator, not to redeem himself in the eyes of the public, but to become the person he knew he should have been all along. He had joined a community outreach program that focused on bridging the gap between law enforcement and the people they served. It was a humble start, and Scott wasn't under any illusions about the road ahead. He knew that trust wasn't something he could rebuild overnight, if ever, but it didn't stop him from trying. One day, Scott was leading a workshop at the local community center, working with a group of teenagers who had grown up with a deep distrust of the police. Many of them had been profiled, harassed, or even arrested for minor infractions. They had every reason to be wary of him, a former cop standing in front of the room. As Scott spoke about his experiences, about how his own biases had led him down the wrong path, he saw the skepticism in their eyes, but he also saw something else: curiosity. These teenagers had heard stories like his before, but rarely from someone who admitted their mistakes so openly. "I used to think being tough was the most important part of my job," Scott told the group, his voice steady but honest. "I thought I was doing the right thing by always being in control, by showing no weakness. But what I've learned is that real strength comes from admitting when you're wrong and working to fix it." One of the teens, a tall boy named Marcus Jr., who had been named after the governor, crossed his arms and raised an eyebrow. "So, you're just sorry now? That's supposed to fix everything." Scott met the boy's gaze without flinching. "No, it doesn't fix everything. I can't change the past, and I know I've hurt people, but I can change how I live from now on. I can work to be better, and that's what I'm trying to do." Marcus Jr. held his stare for a moment before nodding slightly, as if accepting that Scott's journey wasn't about quick fixes, but about a long road toward redemption. After the workshop ended, Scott lingered at the center, cleaning up and thinking about the impact he hoped to have. He wasn't seeking forgiveness, not in the traditional sense, but what he wanted was to build a future where people like him, officers like him, wouldn't make the same mistakes. As he left the community center, Scott ran into Lisa Green, the activist who had led the protests after Marcus's arrest. She looked at him with a mixture of curiosity and skepticism, unsure of what to make of his presence there. "Williams," Lisa said, her voice neutral, "didn't expect to see you here." Scott nodded, his hands in his pockets. "I've been coming here for a while now, trying to help where I can." Lisa studied him for a moment, clearly assessing whether his presence was genuine or performative. "You really think you can change?" Scott looked her in the eye, his expression serious. "I don't know if I'll ever fully change what I did, but I can keep trying to be better. That's all I've got." Lisa's expression softened slightly, though the hardness in her voice remained. We'll see. It wasn't acceptance, but it wasn't rejection either. And for Scott, that was enough to keep going. Months later, Marcus stood at the steps of the state capitol, preparing to give a speech that would mark the culmination of the reforms he had worked so hard to enact. The sun was setting behind him, casting long shadows over the crowd that had gathered to hear him speak. He had been reflecting on the journey that had brought him here, from the humiliating arrest that had thrust him into the spotlight to the sweeping changes that had followed. It hadn't been an easy road, but Marcus had never expected it to be. Real change was never easy. It was hard, it was messy, and it often came with resistance. But today was a day of celebration. The reforms had passed with overwhelming support, and for the first time in his long career, Marcus felt that the people in power were finally listening. The legislation included mandatory training for law enforcement on racial bias, the establishment of community review boards, and increased transparency in policing practices. The reforms didn't just address the symptoms of the problem, they addressed its roots. As he stood in front of the crowd, Marcus took a deep breath and began to speak. We stand here today, not just as witnesses to change, but as participants in it, Marcus said, his voice carrying across the plaza. The reforms we've passed are a step toward a more just and fair society, but they are not the end of the road. This is the beginning of a journey that will take all of us working together to complete. The crowd listened intently, the weight of his words sinking in. Marcus had always been a man of action, but today he was calling on others to take up the mantle of leadership. This wasn't about him, it was about the people. The fight for justice doesn't end with legislation, Marcus continued. It doesn't end with protests or with speeches. The fight for justice is something we must carry with us every day, in the decisions we make, in the way we treat one another, and in the systems we choose to support or dismantle. There was a ripple of applause, but Marcus wasn't finished. We must remember that justice is not just a concept, it's a practice, he said. It's something we must fight for in every corner of our society, from our schools to our workplaces to our homes, and it is our responsibility to make sure that this fight continues long after we are gone. As Marcus finished his speech, the crowd erupted in applause, their voices carrying the hope and determination that had been ignited in the wake of the reforms. But for Marcus, the real victory wasn't in the applause, it was in the knowledge that the movement he had helped spark would continue to grow long after his time in office had ended. Later that evening, Marcus sat in his office, looking out over the city as the lights of Darlington flickered in the distance. The noise of the day had faded, replaced by a quiet stillness that allowed him to reflect on the months that had passed since his arrest. He had been through so much: humiliation, anger, and the intense pressure of public scrutiny. But in the end, he emerged stronger, more resolute in his mission to bring about change. His arrest had been a personal injustice, but it had become the spark for a larger movement, a movement that was still gaining momentum. A knock at the door pulled him from his thoughts. "Come in," Marcus called, and Alicia stepped into the room, a smile on her face. "You were incredible today," she said, taking a seat across from him. Marcus chuckled softly. "I just said what needed to be said. The people out there, they're the ones who will keep this going." Alicia nodded. "You're right, but you've given them the push they needed. Don't underestimate the power of that." Marcus leaned back in his chair, the weight of the day finally lifting. "It's not about me, Alicia. It never was. It's about all of us, and the future we want to build." Alicia smiled. "And we're building it, one step at a time." As Marcus looked out at the city once more, he felt a deep sense of peace. There was still work to be done, but for the first time in a long time, he felt hopeful. Hopeful that the changes they had fought for would last. hopeful that people like Scott Williams could learn, grow, and contribute to a better future, and hopeful that Darlington and the state as a whole could become a beacon of what was possible when people stood up for what was right. The fight for justice was far from over, but tonight, Marcus allowed himself to rest, knowing that the journey had already begun. The reforms in Darlington didn't solve everything overnight, but they were a start. Across the state, other cities began adopting similar policies, and conversations about police reform and racial justice grew louder in places where they had once been silenced. Marcus Reed's story became a symbol of what was possible when injustice was confronted head-on. For Scott Williams, the road to redemption was long and difficult. He continued his work with the community, slowly earning the trust of those he had once alienated. He wasn't perfect, and he didn't expect forgiveness from everyone, but he kept showing up day after day, trying to make a difference in his own small way. And while the protests had faded, the movement for change had not. People across the state and the nation continued to push for reforms, to demand justice, and to fight for a system that treated everyone with dignity and respect. It wasn't an easy road, but it was the right one. Thank you for following the story. Make sure to like, comment, and subscribe to the channel for more stories like this one. Your thoughts on justice and redemption matter, so let us know what you think.